In 1994, a woman named Diane Bishop got off a plane at the newly built Denver International Airport. And just to reach her connecting gate, she walked for 26 minutes. Not because there was a security issue, not because of a schedule conflict, just because of how far apart the gates were. She missed her connection. She wasn't alone. In the airport's first year, missed connections tied to walking time became such a chronic problem that Denver eventually installed one of the longest automated train systems of any airport on Earth just to move people between concourses that were never supposed to be that far apart in the first place. Here's the part that should bother you. Denver didn't accidentally build itself too big. The distance was a decision. Somebody sat in a design meeting, looked at a blueprint, and chose the version where you walk 26 minutes instead of 6. And the reason they chose it has almost nothing to do with airplanes and almost everything to do with what happens in your wallet between the gate and the terminal. I'm going to tell you why airports make you walk so far. And I promise you the real answer is stranger and more deliberate than the airport is just big. Here's what's ahead. The actual architectural logic that airport designers use to route your body through as much retail as physically possible. The hub and spoke system that turned certain airports into deliberate mazes almost overnight in the 1980s. The psychological research on why a 5-minute walk feels like 15 minutes of your life you'll never get back. And why airports exploit that feeling on purpose. And by the end, you'll understand why the worst designed airports in America are, by a specific financial measure, considered the most successful. This isn't a rant about bad architecture. It's about a business model hiding inside a building. And once you see it, you can't unsee it every time you're forced to walk past a Toblerone the size of a canoe on your way to gate C47. Think of an airport terminal as a river, not a hallway, a river. Rivers don't take the shortest path from source to sea. They wind, they pool, they slow down in some places and speed up in others, because the land underneath them shapes the flow. Airport terminals do the same thing to you, except the land underneath isn't rock and soil. It's revenue targets. Every twist in the concourse, every place where the walkway suddenly narrows or opens into a wide plaza. Every gate that got moved 40 feet farther from security than it strictly needed to be. That's the terrain shaping the river, and you are the water. You don't choose your route. The building chooses it for you, and it chooses based on where the money is. The part almost nobody talks about is how an airport actually makes money. If you assumed airports make most of their money from airlines paying to land and park planes, you'd be wrong, and this is where the whole story starts. Airports split revenue into 2 buckets. Aeronautical revenue, which is landing fees, gate leases, and fuel charges paid by airlines, and non-aeronautical revenue, which is everything else. Parking, rental cars, and critically, retail and food concessions. At most major American airports today, non-aeronautical revenue makes up somewhere between 50 and 60% of total airport income. At some of the busiest hubs in the world, that number climbs even higher. Singapore Changi, routinely ranked the best airport on the planet, generates well over half its revenue from retail, not planes. Read that again. The primary financial engine of a modern airport is not aviation. It's shopping. The planes are basically the delivery mechanism that gets a captive audience into the store. Once you understand that one fact, everything else about airport design stops looking like incompetence and starts looking like strategy. Here's the first problem this creates. If an airport's business model depends on you shopping, then an airport that lets you walk from security straight to your gate in 90 seconds is an airport that's leaving money on the table. So airport planners, and I want to be precise here, this isn't conspiracy. This is published in trade journals and airport design textbooks. Deliberately design what's called a single path or forced path layout. You exit security and there is no direct route to the gates. There's exactly one route, and that route runs straight through duty-free, past the coffee stands, alongside the electronics kiosk, through a corridor lined with perfume samples being sprayed by someone whose entire job is your peripheral vision. Heathrow's Terminal 5 is famous in design circles for this. You cannot get from security to most gates without physically walking through the duty-free shop. Not near it, through it. The shelves are arranged so the exit isn't visible from the entrance, meaning you have to walk the entire length of the store before you can even see where the gates are again. That's not bad wayfinding. That's the best wayfinding money can buy, aimed at a different target than you assumed. Now you're probably thinking, okay, that explains the shop right after security. But why does Denver make me walk 26 minutes to gate C93? That's a different mechanism, and it comes from something that happened in the airline industry in 1978. Before that year, U.S. airlines were tightly regulated by the government. Routes, fares, all of it was controlled. Then deregulation happened, and airlines were suddenly free to build their own networks however they wanted. And almost every major airline landed on the same strategy within a few years because the math was too good to ignore. Instead of flying point to point, city to city, airlines started funneling passengers through a small number of central airports called hubs and then spreading them out again to their final destinations. This is the hub and spoke model, and it is brilliant for airline efficiency. A single flight from a small city into a hub can connect to dozens of onward destinations instead of an airline needing a separate direct flight for every single city pair. Delta does this through Atlanta. American does this through Dallas-Fort Worth. United does this through Denver and Chicago. It's why your flight from a mid-sized city to another mid-sized city almost never goes direct. It goes through a hub first. Here's the catch nobody explains to you when you're buying the ticket. Hub airports were not originally sized for the volume of connecting traffic they'd eventually carry. As airlines poured more and more flights through fewer hub cities, those airports had to expand. And they expanded outward, adding concourse after concourse because building up is expensive and land on the edge of a city is comparatively cheap. Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport covers roughly 17,000 acres. That is bigger than the island of Manhattan. Denver International covers 33,000 acres, more than twice the size of Manhattan, for an airport that mostly exists to let people switch planes. The distance you're walking isn't a design flaw. It's the physical footprint of an airline's entire connection strategy, built one expansion at a time, with almost no regard for how far a human being can comfortably walk in the 25 minutes most airlines allow you between a landing gate and a departure gate. This is where the two systems collide, and this is the actual answer to the question in the title. You walk so far for two separate but reinforcing reasons. First, the hub and spoke system physically stretched airports out to handle a volume of connecting passengers nobody originally planned for, spreading gates across concourses that can be a mile or more apart. Second, layered on top of that sprawling footprint, airport planners deliberately route your specific path through the highest revenue retail zones, even when a shorter path exists. You're not just walking far because the airport is big, you're walking a specifically engineered route through a big airport, and the engineering optimizes for your spending, not your comfort. The psychology behind this is where it gets uncomfortable. There's a well-known finding in transit and behavioral research, sometimes called the walking penalty. Researchers studying how people perceive travel time found that time spent walking, especially through unfamiliar or crowded environments, is perceived by the human brain as roughly 1.5 to 2 times longer than the same amount of time spent sitting still, like waiting at a gate. In other words, a 12-minute walk through a crowded terminal doesn't just feel a little longer than a 12-minute wait, it can feel like 20 minutes of your actual finite life disappearing. Transit planners in cities like London have used this exact research to justify billions of dollars in infrastructure, because they know that shaving 5 real minutes off a passenger's walking transfer buys far more perceived satisfaction than shaving 5 minutes off their waiting time. Airports know this too. And instead of using that knowledge to shorten your walk, in many cases they use it to disguise the walk by breaking it into segments. A moving walkway here, a train there, a change of scenery every few hundred feet, food smells at specific intervals. Each segment resets your perception of how long you've been walking. The same trick amusement parks use in queue lines, where a switchback maze feels shorter than a straight line of the same length, because your brain measures the wait in segments, not in actual elapsed distance. There's a name for this design tactic among airport architects, the meander. You take what could be a straight 300-yard corridor and you bend it, not randomly, but through specific storefronts, because a bent path with visual variety and commercial stimulation feels shorter and more tolerable than the same distance walked in a straight, boring line, even though the bent version is often physically longer. Think about walking through a museum for a second. A well-designed museum doesn't march you in a straight line. It curves you through rooms, because curved, varied paths keep you engaged and moving forward without fatigue. Airports learned this same trick, except the exhibits are duty-free liquor and $11 breakfast sandwiches, And the goal isn't your enrichment, it's your spending. This is why some of the most maze like, walk heavy airports in the country consistently score highest in something the aviation industry calls dwell time optimization, a metric that literally measures how long they can keep you inside the terminal, awake, moving, and exposed to retail before your flight boards. A longer, more meandering walk isn't the airport failing to serve you efficiently. In the language of the industry, it's often the airport succeeding. Now, here's the part that genuinely surprised me when I started digging into airport revenue reports. Some of the most criticized, most complained about airports in America for their long walks are, by their own internal financial metrics, considered design triumphs. Denver International, despite decades of jokes about its distances and its infamous train system, generates hundreds of millions of dollars annually in non-aeronautical revenue, and airport officials have openly credited the layout, the exposure passengers get to concessions during those long transfers, as part of why. Meanwhile, older, more compact airports built before the hub and spoke era, the ones where you can walk from curb to gate in under 10 minutes, tend to generate comparatively less retail revenue per passenger because there's simply less time and less forced exposure to spend money. The airports you complain about the most, on average, are often the ones making the most money off the exact thing you're complaining about. That's not a coincidence. That's the business model working exactly as it intended. Here's a specific comparison because the numbers tell the story better than I can. Take Portland International Airport, which is consistently ranked among the most beloved airports in the country, partly because it's small enough that most gates are a reasonable walk from security, and partly because Portland made a deliberate choice decades ago to fill its terminal with genuinely good local restaurants instead of generic chains, so the experience doesn't feel like a forced march through a shopping mall. Now, compare that to Charlotte Douglas International, a major American Airlines hub where the concourses stretch out for what feels like a small city and connecting passengers routinely report walks of 15 to 25 minutes between gates, sometimes requiring a shuttle train just to make the transfer in time. Charlotte's non-aeronautical revenue per passenger significantly outpaces Portland's. Passengers rate Portland's experience far higher in satisfaction surveys. Charlotte generates more retail dollars per person passing through. Two airports, two completely different design philosophies, two completely different financial outcomes, and the uncomfortable truth is that from a pure revenue standpoint, the airport you hate walking through might be the one doing its job correctly. There's one more mechanism worth walking through, because I don't want you to think this is only about retail. There's a second reason certain gates get placed far away from the terminal core, and it has to do with something called gate premiums. Airlines pay more to lease gates that are close to the main terminal, security checkpoints, and major connecting hubs within the airport, because those gates minimize misconnections and passenger complaints. Airlines that pay less for their leases, often budget or lower margin carriers, or airlines running less profitable routes, frequently get assigned the gates at the far end of the concourse, the ones that require the longest walk. So sometimes when you feel like you specifically got unlucky with a brutal gate assignment, you're not imagining it. You may have booked a row or an airline that, for financial reasons on the airline side, was placed in the least convenient physical location in the entire building. The distance you're walking is, in that case, quite literally a reflection of how much your airline was willing to pay not to make you walk it. Here's the human cost side of this that rarely gets discussed. For most healthy adult travelers, a 20-minute walk through a terminal is an inconvenience. For a meaningful percentage of travelers, it's genuinely difficult or physically painful. Elderly passengers, people traveling with young children, people with mobility limitations, people recovering from surgery, people simply exhausted after an overnight flight, all of them are subject to the exact same forced path design that assumes an able-bodied person moving at a brisk pace with nothing but a rolling carry-on. Airports do provide wheelchair assistance and mobility carts, but the demand for that assistance has grown so much at major hub airports that wait times for a wheelchair can themselves eat up the very connection window the passenger was trying to protect. There have been documented cases at hub airports of passengers requesting wheelchair assistance for a connection and waiting so long for that assistance to arrive that they missed the flight anyway. The accommodation itself becoming a bottleneck inside a system that was never really built around the person, but around the throughput. So what do you actually do with this information? Because I don't want to just make you angry at airport architecture and leave you there. There is a practical layer to this. First, understand that connection time listed as the legal minimum by an airline is almost never the realistic minimum at a hub airport with a forced path layout. If an airline shows you a 35-minute connection as bookable, that number usually reflects a straight line distance calculation, not the actual meandering, retail laden route you'll be walking, and definitely not the added time from a shuttle train, a terminal change, or a security recheck if you're connecting between international and domestic zones. When you're booking a connecting itinerary through a known sprawling hub, treat any connection under an hour as genuinely risky, regardless of what the airline's booking engine tells you is technically allowed. Second, learn which hubs are notorious for this specific design pattern before you book. Denver, Charlotte, Dallas-Fort Worth, Chicago O'Hare, and Atlanta are consistently flagged by frequent flyers for punishing connection walks, while airports like Portland, Salt Lake City's newer terminal, and several regional airports are known for comparatively humane layouts. This single piece of research, checking the layout reputation of your connecting hub before you book, can save you more stress than almost any other travel decision you'll make. Third, if you have any mobility concern whatsoever, request wheelchair or cart assistance at the time of booking. Not at the gate, because pre-booked assistance gets prioritized differently than day of requests, and at a hub like Atlanta or Charlotte during peak hours, that difference can be the gap between making your flight and not. Fourth, and this one sounds small, but genuinely changes the experience, if you know you're walking through a forced path retail corridor, decide in advance whether you're going to engage with it or not. Airports are betting on decision fatigue. After a flight, your willpower is lower, your blood sugar is probably low, and you are walking directly through an environment engineered by people who study exactly that vulnerability. Knowing that going in gives you back some of the control the layout was designed to take from you. Here's the identity level point I actually want you to leave with. The frustration you feel walking through an airport isn't a personal failing, and it isn't random bad luck with gate assignments. It's the visible result of an economic model that was decided decades before you booked your ticket, built into concrete and steel, and quietly optimized every year using the same passenger flow data that any retailer would use to decide where to put the milk in a grocery store. At the back, so you have to walk past everything else to get to it. You are not wandering through architecture, you're moving through a piece of financial engineering that happens to also get planes off the ground. Once you see it this way, the mile-long walk to gate C93 stops feeling like an accident you're unlucky enough to suffer through, and starts feeling like exactly what it is: the terrain of a river shaped very deliberately, to make sure that on your way from one flight to another, you pass by as much of the store as humanly possible. Here are your 3 takeaways. 1. The length of your walk in a major hub airport is not incidental. It's a direct outcome of a business model where non-aeronautical revenue, meaning retail and food, often accounts for more than half of total airport income, which means keeping you walking, exposed, and near shops for longer is frequently in the airport's direct financial interest. 2. The specific route you're forced to take, not just the distance, but the meandering path through duty-free and fast food courts, is a deliberate design choice modeled on retail and theme park psychology, exploiting the fact that walking time is perceived as significantly longer and more taxing than waiting time, and using that perception gap to your disadvantage rather than your benefit. 3. Protect yourself with information the airport isn't going to hand you voluntarily. Know which hubs are notorious for punishing layouts. Treat official minimum connection times as optimistic fiction rather than fact. And book mobility assistance in advance if you need it, because in a building engineered around throughput and dwell time, nobody is going to slow the system down to protect your 25-minute connection except you. The next time you land at a sprawling hub and see the gate number flash up on the screen, gate C93, and feel that familiar drop in your stomach. Remember what you now know. That distance was chosen. Somebody in a design meeting decided that version of the airport was the profitable one. And now that you understand the mechanism behind it, you're not just another passenger being quietly funneled past a perfume counter. You're someone who knows exactly why the walk feels this long and exactly what to do about it. If this changed the way you'll look at your next layover, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.